here's my central pivot point, sometimes abbreviated PP or CPP for central pivot point. That's the high plus the close plus the low divided by 3. Okay, don't get busy on the next part. You don't have to memorize these, you guys. I just want to show you how the other pivots are derived from the central pivot point. Okay, the next pivot is support 1, or otherwise abbreviated S1, and that is simply taking the prior pivot, subtracting the high of the prior period from above. Okay, pivot minus the high, take the result, multiply it by 2. That gives you your support 1 under your central pivot point. And remember, you don't have to remember the math. I just want to show you where these guys come from. Resistance 1, pivot minus the low multiplied by 2. And that gives you R1, resistance 1, above the central pivot point. Okay, you guys with me so far? One central pivot point, one below, one above. Great. It actually doesn't matter, Jay. I'm saying it this way because it makes more sense, but it doesn't matter much. The ones where it really matters, I actually put in parentheses, so you know which operation to do first. Okay? Here's S2 and R2, one above, one below. You know, I list the formulas there so you can have them, but once again, knowing them isn't going to help you trade fibs better or worse. Okay, it's more of an FYI, but it's there for you if you want. We've got two more, S3 and R3, and they go above and below S2 and R2, okay? So there's your pivot points. That's how it'll look. And I'm coloring them, incidentally, you guys, exactly the way they'll look on your chart if you download our pivot indicator. Okay, so the colors will look familiar for you. Next thing we have is our median. Well, what's a median? A median, very simply, is the space between two pivots. Or another way to express that, you take pivot number 1 plus pivot number 2, and you divide by 2. And you get the halfway point between the two pivots. So there you go. There's our medians. There's 6 of them in all, right? We've got 7 pivot points, 1 central one, 3 above, 3 below, 7 pivot points. So we're going to have 6 medians in between them. Now the medians are numbered a little bit differently. Okay, you'll notice pivot points. We start with the central pivot in the middle. We number up on our resistance levels as we go to the outside. We number up on our support levels as we go down from the center. Medians are always numbered bottom to top. And I don't know why this is, you guys. I really don't. It's just how it's done. You start at the bottom, and you don't start with 1. You start with 0. And then you number up to 5. 0 to 5. Or in other words, a total of 6. Okay? So there's the layout. You might not always see all of these levels. It depends on what time frame you're zoomed in on, right? If you're doing daily pivots and you're looking at an hourly chart, you might only see 2 or 3 of these, okay? Depending what section you're looking at. But the good thing about our indicator, you simply hold your mouse on the line and the label will pop up showing you exactly which pivot it is and at what price level it is. Just hold your mouse over it and it'll show you in a pop-up. But it's good to see the overall structure. Okay, central in the middle, 3 resistance levels above, counting from the inside to the outside, 3 support levels below, counting from the inside to the outside, and then 6 medians in between those, counting from the bottom up, 0 to 5. So looking at the color, looking whether it's a solid or dotted line, and looking where you are relative to what's above and below, you should be able to find your place within this map on any chart you pull up. Okay? That's the idea. That's why I wanted to show you the whole map, so you can orientate yourself within it. Okay? Let me give you some rules for movement. You understand where the pivot points are. Let me show you how to use them now. Okay? If you have a reversal that takes place at R1, the move most often is going to go to S1. If you have a bounce or a reversal that happens at S1, the move will very often take you to R1. Okay, they're interchangeable. If you have a bounce that happens at S2, very often the move will take you to R2. And if you have a bounce at R2, you're typically going to S2. Sounds a little bit like Star Wars, doesn't it? R2, S2. Pretty simple pattern, you guys. As you can guess, if you have a bounce all the way out at R3, you're probably going to S3. If you have a bounce at S3, you're probably going up to R3. Okay? That's our pivot points. Medians are a little bit different. What happens with the medians is you basically skip one, and this is why I have them as dotted lines, because if you have a bounce at a solid line, look to go to another solid line. If you have a bounce at a dotted line, look at the dotted lines. Okay, that's why we've got them coded differently. And basically the rule with medians is you skip one and go to the next. So if your bounce is at M0, you skip M1 and you go to M2. If your bounce is at M2, you skip M1, go to M0. Okay? If your bounce is at M1 as support, if your bounce is at M1, you skip M2, you go to M3. If your bounce is at M3, you skip M2, go down to M1. M2 to M4, M4 to M2. M3 to M5, M5 to M3. Okay? Those are all the situations you're likely to encounter. Well, you might be asking yourself, what happens if you go beyond R3 or beyond S3? Well, keep in mind these are daily pivots. Every day when you open your charts, you will find they will have shifted a little bit. Okay? So if you go beyond S3, don't worry. Overnight, your pivots will shift down lower because of that big move, and the next day you will have more room to go to S3. Or you will have a bounce off of the next S1 or S2 along the way to the new S3, in which case you know about how high your long is going to go. Okay? Great question, Daniel. There's no end point for a bounce off the central pivot point. For that, you'll need to use something else, maybe a moving average, an envelope, a fib. Okay? Prior high and low. You'll need to use something else in order to find the most likely reversal point. But, you know, if you start out in the morning and you bounce off the central pivot point as a ceiling and start to move down, well, you probably know how price is going to move the rest of the morning. And if you start off your morning and you just broke above the central pivot and you found some support there and bounced up, well, it's a pretty safe bet that you're going to keep moving up the rest of that session, or at least till some other major news hits to change people's opinions. Okay? So central pivot point doesn't by itself give you an end point, but because it's the center, it's pretty good at establishing direction. And then here's the thing. Maybe it'll go to a round number. Maybe it'll go to a prior high. But guess what? If that prior high happens to line up at R2, well, boom. And then you bounce down. Well, now you know exactly how far down the move down is going to go. So you see what I mean? It doesn't always give you the answer by itself, but it'll set you up for something that'll take you to the next step. And the next step takes you to the step after that, and the step after that. And remember, your pivots also move from day to day. So it's not like you bounce between R2 and S2 forever. right? This level might shift and be your M2 the next day. Or you might be moving down from R2 to S2, but some news comes out along the way, and suddenly the markets do an abrupt reversal at M2. Okay, then we know we're going up to M4. So you just keep taking it one step at a time, and each step typically leads you to the next step. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you where the markets are going to be next week or next month. All I can figure out is what to do for the next trade. That's all I really need to know. I'll worry about the trade after that. So that's the movement rules. A lot of people make mistakes on the movement rules. Now you know what they actually are. The other place for a lot of confusion amongst pivot points, and this is probably the #1 mistake made with pivot points, you guys, it's calibration. Okay, how do you set your pivot points up correctly? I'm going to take a little bit of time to discuss this because I want you guys to get it right. Steve, absolutely. Go ahead and post your questions. If it's relevant to what I'm talking about right now, I'll answer the question right now. Okay? But in order to avoid jumping around, if it's on something else, I will wait to answer it till the end of class. Okay? But I will do my best to get to all your questions. I just don't want you to think I'm ignoring you, Steve, okay? If I don't answer it, it's because I'm waiting till the end to do it. But yeah, go ahead and post your questions. I'll get to as many of them as I can. For calibration, first of all, you got to figure out the start and end of a day. Remember, we're using daily pivots. And there's some discrepancy over what marks the start and end of a day in a 24-hour market. I have found through trial and error, you guys, that for Forex, the best start hour to use to mark the start of your day for the daily pivots is midnight GMT. Okay? And this is simple trial and error. New York traders will beat me up and yell at me and say, no, the end of the day is 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Yes, if you're trading stocks on the New York Stock Exchange, because that's when it closes. Okay? As a matter of fact, for all futures contracts, doesn't matter if it's a stock index, commodity, okay? For all futures contracts, I do use 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but not for Forex. And I'll argue that with any New York trader till they're blue in the face, because I have simply tested it over years and years of trading. Okay? For stuff based in the United States, what are known as session pivots as opposed to daily pivots, 5 Eastern Time works just fine because there's no question over when the New York Stock Exchange will close. Okay? And also, 5 p.m. Eastern corresponds with 4 p.m. Chicago time, which is when the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the Chicago Board of Trade close for commodities. So it's convenient. Both of them happen at the same time. 5 Eastern is 4 p.m. Chicago time. Okay, so that's true for all futures contracts, stocks and commodities alike. But for Forex, midnight GMT. Simply because I've tried it and it works. London still does far more trading volume than New York does. And as far as the rest of the world, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, guess what? They're former British colonies. They use GMT as well, at least in the financial fields. You'll find that in 2 areas in particular, international finance and international shipping, GMT is more or less the standard. And that is correct, Darminder. GMT all year round. What's going to change is your offset. And I haven't discussed offsets yet, okay? because we use midnight GMT to mark the start and end of the day, doesn't mean you always put 0 in your start hour setting. Okay? 0 if your broker also uses GMT. The next thing you got to figure out is the offset. And that's not the offset between your local time and your broker. It has nothing to do with where you live, you guys, or your relationship to GMT, or your relationship to your broker's clock. Okay? The offset is the difference between your broker's server time and GMT. And don't just assume, oh, well, my broker's in London, they must be on GMT. Because as you mentioned, Darminder, you know, even London is not on GMT for half the year. They're on something called British summertime right now, which is GMT +1. Okay? So don't assume my broker's in London, they're on GMT. My broker is in Cyprus, so they're GMT +3. Okay? Double check it, because not all brokers have their servers in their local office. Their servers in a server farm somewhere, and it might be a completely different country. It's not always a given. Best way to find out, very simply, go to your 1-minute chart. And this is the only time I will advocate going to the 1-minute chart. I think scalping is for people that either like to gamble or who like to work really, really hard for their money. I prefer longer time frames myself because I check my trade, I set my stop and target, and I go take my wife out on the date. I come back later to count how much money I made. I don't like to be glued to my screen all day long. That's just me personally. Okay, but for calibrating pivots, we need the 1-minute chart. And all you're going to do, you're going to look at the rightmost timestamp at the lower right corner of your chart. Okay, and if you see that it's, for example, 11 o'clock GMT, but your last candle that printed on your 1-minute chart says 1300, or in other words 1 p.m., you know that your GMT offset is +2. Right? 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock is +2. So that's what you put in your start hour setting. It's not just 0. It's 0 plus or minus whatever your offset is. The difference between GMT and the most current candle on your 1-minute chart. That's how you find out for sure. And that's the number. Okay, Darminder? That's the number that changes during daylight savings time. If your broker's in London, it might be 0 during the winter. The start hour might be 1 because of British summertime during the summer. Okay, the good news is you only got to check it twice a year and adjust it twice a year. So it's whatever the offset number is, plus or minus. And remember, if it's a minus, basically 0 becomes 24. You don't want a negative number in there, though I think on many trading platforms it will accept a negative number. But ideally you want a number between 0 and 23 because there's 24 hours in a day. So if you have to subtract, simply subtract from 24. Add to 0 or subtract your offset from 24. And then obviously if you're trading futures and or commodities, and yes, Steve, you could absolutely use pivots for those. The only thing that changes is your start hour setting. Okay? Then you add or subtract that number to 17, whatever your offset is. Okay? So remember, you're calibrating to your broker's server, not to your broker's office and not to where you may live personally. The offset is the difference between your broker's server clock and the GMT clock. That's all it is. And hopefully that'll help you use pivots with more precision. If you've tried pivots in the past and they didn't work for you, that's probably why. All right, let me answer a couple of these questions that came in, and then we'll try this out on some charts. Jason, I don't use Metastock personally, but just do some Googling. You know, type pivots Metastock. I'm sure you'll come up with something. If not, you know, I gave you guys the formulas at the beginning of class. You know, it's pretty easy. You can plot you can plot a moving average or a horizontal line based on those formulas. That'll work too. But Metastock is popular enough, I'm sure you'll find something. Just do some Googling. And you're exactly correct. For stocks, you do want to use session or end of day. Okay? It's just Forex where we go around the clock. Jagdish, you were saying sometimes you get false calculations. I've had very few of that. The key is calibrating your start hour correctly. Once you have that set, I haven't had too many problems. Jay, you were asking how often my pivots are correct in determining direction. It's hard for me to say because I don't use pivots by themselves. I usually use them in combination with another indicator. Pivots help me identify support, resistance, and targets based on the most recent reversal. They don't identify momentum. They don't identify direction, except in the case of the central pivot point. I just posted a link in the chat window for you. There you'll find a link to some other webinars that we've recorded for you, including a couple really good ones in collaboration with Trader's Log. And they will cover exactly that. What other indicators can you combine together with pivots to help you establish direction, momentum, acceleration, deceleration, all that good stuff. Okay? Pivots identify support, resistance, reversals, and targets. That's what they're good at. William, it is being recorded. The link will be sent out to both my list and the traderslog.com list, so I encourage you to sign up for both. Okay, and we'll send the link out as soon as we have it. John, a lot of countries are debating that. My vote is for yes. It would mean I can spend more time trading and less time calibrating. No, that's not the only reason. I hate running around my house and trying to find every last clock. So we'd have to sit in the dark a little bit longer, but I think everybody's lives would be a little easier. Keep in mind, daylight savings time was invented during World War I to save on resources. I think we're a little past that, personally. Anthony was asking about time frames. Do I trade daily chart, 4-hour chart, or what? Actually, what I like to do, I look at the weekly chart at the start of every week. I look at the daily chart at the start of every day, kind of figure out what's happening, identify my highs and lows, my prior support resistance, and I set up like little boxes or windows to trade within based on the weekly daily chart. Then I zoom in to the 4-hour chart to establish the current direction. And then once I have that, I've got a box and I've got a direction, I go to the 1-hour chart, and that's where I look for my entry signal. So I break up my days and weeks into little hourly chunks. Okay? My primary trading time frames are the 4-hour and 1-hour chart. 4-hour for direction, 1 hour for entry and exit signals in that direction only. I discard everything else as noise, but it's based on highs and lows off of the weekly and daily chart. So first I get the big picture, and then I zoom in and find the trades within that. That's kind of my own personal trading style. But the thing about pivots, you guys, they'll work in all time frames. They're calculated daily based on Forex or based on sessions for stocks and commodities, but once you have them plotted, you can zoom into any time frame and see them. That's the cool thing about it. And Sudeep, you said your broker's in India. Same thing. You open up the 1-minute chart, and you note what the time is for the most current candle that printed. And then you add or subtract that. You figure out the difference between that and GMT, plus or minus, round it off to the nearest hour. Okay, so wherever your broker is located, just look at the most recent timestamp on the 1-minute chart, compare that against GMT. And that's what you add or subtract to either of these start hours, depending on the instrument you're trading. All right, we've got a few minutes left, you guys, so let's look at a couple examples. Now, don't jump out of your chair, okay? The euro didn't move 1,000 points while I've been talking. This is a PowerPoint presentation, not a live chart, okay? So just didn't want anybody to freak out. And actually here, I show you exactly what I mean. Just the most recent timestamp, the one on the furthest right, and that's what you compare to GMT. Okay? And there's a website, by the way, if you don't know what GMT is currently, timeanddate.com will help you out. But there's also a really great little plug-in, those of you that use Firefox as your browser. I love this little plug-in called Fox Clocks. And that way, when I'm looking up news or anything else to help my trading, I have multiple monitors. Fox Clocks lets me put the current time in several different countries down at the bottom of my web browser. So I'll usually have it for each of the major markets: Sydney, Tokyo, Dubai, GMT, New York. Okay, each of the major markets I'll have a little clock for, so I always know when things are opening and closing. And by the way, those of you using MetaTrader specifically, you guys, right here, start hour. Okay, that's the setting you want to change, and you just double-click in there. My broker for Forex happens to be in Cyprus, so they're currently 3 hours ahead of GMT. So you see I've got a start hour setting of 3 in here. Okay, and you find that just right-click after you plot your pivots, right-click on any of the pivot lines, go to Properties, and it's the second tab over called Inputs. And to change the value, you double-click in it. That's all you got to change to calibrate your pivots. Click OK, and you're good to go. Okay, so here's first the pivots plotted. Okay, and you can see, for example, first thing we start out, and you can see, by the way, where a day starts and ends. That's another cool side effect of daily pivots. They stay at the same value for 24 hours, and then there's a shift to up or down, and then they keep the same value for 24 hours, and then there's a shift up or down. So you can very easily, visually on your chart, pick out one full day of trading. Okay, you can see this is Monday, this is Tuesday, this is Wednesday. You're looking at 3 days of trading on this particular chart. Okay, and you can see we started off the first day. Here's a great example of direction. We start off the day breaking the central pivot point, abbreviated in this indicator, daily PP. Okay, we break below that, we come up, and we retest it as resistance. So it's become our ceiling. Great. So we go down. And it depends how you trade. You could close half of your trade at the first support level, close half of your trade at your second. You could leave it open till you get a bounce. You know, however you like to trade. But you basically trade till you put in a bottom. And this, again, could line up also with a fib, with a moving average. Chances are you'd be combining it with a second indicator. But once you have a reversal at S2, you know exactly where you're going, right? You're going up to R2. Not the first red line, but the second red line. Right? You see that? We bounce off the second blue line. We go to the second red line. Now, yeah, we shot a little bit past it, you guys. Little bit of advice. Give up the need to perfectly predict tops and bottoms. or in other words, reversal points. This might impress your friends, but it's not very profitable. The profit is the safe 85 to 90% of the pips in between. Okay? That's what you're going after. This is safe profit. This is extremely risky. Cheryl, let me give you a link. I actually gave this at the start of class, but here it is again for anybody that came in late. It's in your chat window. You can download this indicator free of charge from our website. Okay, so there's the first move. To make sense of some of the others, you guys, we're going to need to add in our medians to help complete the picture. Okay, for example, this one you might have thought, well, but we didn't go from R2 back to S2. Well, that's because, remember, we overshot it by a little bit. We landed on a median. And our rule with medians, if you recall from the beginning, you skip one, you go to the next. Okay? So that's why this move ended shortly and abruptly. Okay? And you can see as the chart unfolds, here's an S1 to an R1. Okay, and this one, you could actually trade back the other way. R1 down to S1. Okay, we did overshoot it, but remember, this is what you're targeting. You don't know ahead of time that you're going to overshoot it. Once you do overshoot it, you can see how far you overshot it by. In this case, we went to the next median. So, okay, you skip one median, dotted lines, and target the next. So each step sets you up for the next step. See how that works? And that's just one example, you guys. Download the indicator, plot it on your charts. I don't want you to take my word for it. Try it out for yourself. Okay, a little bit about going further, you guys. I want to tell you about FXnight.com. I started this web to a dozen other websites just to get all the information I needed. And what I wanted to do was to put all that information in one place. Now, we do offer a pro training program. It's won multiple